The heavy bag trembled under the relentless assault as Mike Tyson unleashed his signature combinations with the controlled ferocity that had made him the most feared heavyweight champion in boxing history. October 14, 1987. Al Pacino stood near the ring apron at Gleason's gym in Brooklyn, watching the 21-year-old destroyer prepare for his upcoming title defense against Tyrell Biggs. At 47, Al was researching for a potential boxing film role, but in this temple of legitimate violence, surrounded by men who earned their living through the calculated infliction of damage, he felt like an observer studying a world where pretending could get you seriously hurt. But what happened in the next 20 minutes would prove that some kinds of toughness couldn't be measured by knockout power or championship belts. Gleason's gym was boxing's most authentic cathedral, a place where fighters came not for publicity or photo opportunities, but for the hard, dangerous work of preparing to hurt and be hurt by other trained killers. The walls were stained with decades of sweat and blood, the heavy bags hung from chains that had absorbed punishment from some of the greatest fighters in history, and the air carried the metallic taste of serious training mixed with the particular tension that surrounded men preparing for legalized violence. Mike Tyson dominated this space like a natural disaster given human form. His presence filled Gleason's with an energy that made even experienced professionals nervous. Not because he was cruel or unpredictable, but because his capacity for violence was so absolute, so perfectly developed, that being near him felt like standing next to a loaded weapon that could discharge at any moment. Al had been observing Tyson's training for 2 hours, studying not just the mechanics of boxing but the psychology of someone who'd weaponized aggression into an art form. Unlike other actors who might focus on the visual aspects of fighting, Al's method approach demanded understanding the mental state of men who chose to solve problems through controlled brutality. The young champion moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent his entire life perfecting the science of destruction. Every punch was thrown with maximum bad intentions, every combination designed to end fights rather than merely win them. When Tyson hit the heavy bag, the sound wasn't just the impact of glove on leather, it was the sound of bone-deep violence looking for a target. "Who's the actor?" Tyson asked his trainer Kevin Rooney, his voice carrying the flat Brooklyn accent that had become synonymous with boxing's most devastating puncher. "Al Pacino," Rooney replied, toweling sweat from Tyson's face between rounds. "He's doing research for a boxing movie." Tyson's dark eyes focused on Al with the predatory attention he usually reserved for opponents during the pre-fight stare-down. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was an assessment happening, the kind of evaluation that fighters made automatically when sizing up any man who entered their space. "Pacino," Tyson said, walking directly toward Al with the rolling swagger that had intimidated every heavyweight contender of his generation. "The Godfather guy." "That's right," Al replied, extending his hand respectfully to the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Tyson's handshake was crushing, not from conscious effort, but from hands that had been conditioned to generate devastating power with minimal conscious thought. When he released Al's hand, his expression carried the particular dismissal that natural fighters showed toward people they considered fundamentally soft. "So you're making a boxing movie," Tyson said, his voice carrying more curiosity than hostility. "You gonna play a fighter?" "I'm exploring the possibility," Al replied carefully, understanding that in this environment, every word would be evaluated for authenticity by men who'd built their lives around the most honest form of competition imaginable. "You know anything about fighting?" Tyson asked, beginning to circle Al like a predator evaluating prey. "Real fighting, not movie fighting?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, drawing the attention of every serious fighter in Gleason's gym. When Mike Tyson questioned someone's toughness, even indirectly, it became everyone's business to watch and evaluate. "I understand that real fighting requires something most people don't have," Al replied, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that had made him famous. Tyson laughed. Not mockingly, but with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never encountered civilian toughness that impressed him. "Man, actors are soft," Tyson said, his voice gaining confidence as he sensed what he believed was an easy target. "No disrespect, but you live in a world where everything's pretend." Where you can yell, "Cut," if things get too real. Several professional fighters gathered closer, recognizing that the heavyweight champion was building toward one of his famous psychological demolitions, the kind he usually reserved for opponents, but occasionally directed toward civilians who wandered into his world without proper respect. In the ring, Tyson continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality he used during pre-fight interviews. "There's no script. No director. No stunt coordinator. Just me trying to separate you from your consciousness, and you trying to do the same to me." Al remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, but something was building behind his dark eyes that the more experienced fighters in Gleason's began to recognize. "You actors," Tyson said, his voice gaining intensity, "you play tough guys, but you're soft. You've never had someone really try to hurt you. Never had to function when someone's throwing leather at your head with bad intentions." The implicit challenge was unmistakable. Tyson wasn't just questioning Al's acting ability, he was questioning his fundamental manhood, his right to portray fighters on screen, his understanding of what real violence required. "Actors are soft," Tyson repeated, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You can pretend to be tough for cameras, but when faced with real violence, real danger, you'd fold like everyone else who's never been tested." The silence that followed was electric and dangerous. Mike Tyson had just publicly dismissed Al Pacino in front of New York's most serious fighters, and everyone present understood that some kind of response was required. When Al finally spoke, his words would prove that Mike Tyson's definition of toughness was about to be challenged in ways the young destroyer had never imagined. When Al finally spoke, his words would prove that Mike Tyson's definition of toughness was about to be challenged in ways the young destroyer had never imagined. The silence in Gleason's gym stretched beyond what the serious fighters were accustomed to experiencing during training sessions. Al remained motionless, his dark eyes focused on Tyson's powerful frame with an intensity that seemed to make every heavy bag and speed bag in the gym fade into background noise. When he finally broke his silence, his voice carried a quality that made every professional boxer present stop their workouts completely. "Mike," Al said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled power that had made him famous, "you want to know what real violence looks like?" Tyson nodded, perhaps expecting a defensive explanation about the challenges of portraying fighters on screen. "Real violence isn't what happens in the ring," Al said, his voice taking on the passionate intensity that had defined his greatest performances. "Real violence is what happens when someone you love is threatened by people who have nothing to lose and everything to gain from destroying your family." The gym was completely quiet now, every serious fighter understanding that Al's response was heading somewhere none of them had anticipated. "When I prepared to play Michael Corleone," Al continued, his voice gaining power with each word, "I didn't just study organized crime from books or movies. I spent 2 years with men who'd lived that life, men who understood what it meant to kill someone and still sleep at night." Tyson's confident expression began to flicker, perhaps sensing that this wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from someone he'd just publicly dismissed. "You want to know what I learned about violence, Mike?" Al asked, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone present suddenly more alert. "I learned that the most dangerous men aren't the ones who threaten you with their fists. They're the ones who smile while they plan your destruction." Al stepped closer to Tyson, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building energy that made several professional fighters shift uncomfortably despite their own fighting credentials. "Real violence," Al said, his voice building with controlled intensity, "is sitting across a dinner table from someone you're planning to have killed, making conversation about their family while you calculate the best way to eliminate them without leaving evidence." The devastation was building systematically, but Al was just getting started. "You talk about bad intentions in the ring," Al continued, his voice gaining strength. "But ring violence has rules, Mike. Referees, doctors, corner men who can stop the fight if things go too far. The violence I studied for Michael Corleone has no rules, no referee, no mercy." Tyson remained perfectly still, his legendary intimidation factor apparently ineffective against someone operating on a psychological level he'd never encountered. When I prepared for Scarface, Al said, his voice taking on the controlled menace that had made him legendary, I spent months learning what cocaine does to a man's capacity for violence. Not just using it, but understanding how it removes every moral restraint, every psychological barrier that keeps civilized men from becoming monsters. Al looked directly into Tyson's eyes, his gaze carrying the kind of focused intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Tony Montana wasn't just violent, Mike, Al said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying more power than any shout. He was completely disconnected from human empathy. He could torture someone to death and feel nothing but mild annoyance that it was taking longer than expected. The silence in Gleason's gym was profound and uncomfortable. Every fighter present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Someone challenging Mike Tyson's authority in his own domain, not through physical intimidation but through psychological demonstration. But you want to know what really separates actors from fighters? Al asked, his voice taking on a new quality that commanded absolute attention from every person in the gym. Tyson nodded, though his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Fighters like you learn to hurt people efficiently, Al said, his voice gaining power. But actors like me learn to become people who can hurt others without feeling anything about it. We don't just study violence, we inhabit the minds of people for whom violence is as natural as breathing. Al's voice carried absolute conviction as he continued his systematic dismantling of Tyson's worldview. When you step into the ring, you're Mike Tyson trying to win a fight, Al said, his words cutting through the gym's silence like surgical instruments. When I become Michael Corleone or Tony Montana, I stop being Al Pacino entirely. I become someone who can order executions over breakfast and feel nothing but satisfaction that business is being handled properly. Tyson stood speechless, his legendary quick wit apparently deserting him for the first time in his professional career. So when you say actors are soft, Al continued, his voice returning to respectful tones while maintaining its underlying steel, remember that we're soft enough to explore parts of human nature that would destroy people who only know physical violence. Al straightened his jacket with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. You've learned to hurt people with your hands, Mike, Al said, delivering what would become the most quoted response in Gleason's gym history. I've learned to become people who could destroy lives with a phone call and sleep peacefully afterward. Which one of us do you think understands real violence? The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute before Tyson extended his powerful hand to Al. Man, Tyson said, his voice carrying none of its earlier dismissal, I never thought about it like that. That's some deep stuff. Al shook Tyson's hand firmly, his grip respectful but not deferential. Mike, what you do in the ring requires incredible courage, Al replied. Physical courage that most people, including me, could never match. But what I do requires psychological courage, the willingness to explore human darkness that most people spend their lives avoiding. The handshake lasted several seconds, everyone present understanding that they'd witnessed something unprecedented. Not a victory of one approach over another, but a recognition that toughness existed in forms that even the most accomplished fighters had never considered. You know what? Tyson said, his voice thoughtful rather than challenging, I always wondered what it takes mentally to become completely different people. Like, how do you turn off being Al Pacino and become someone else completely? It requires everything you've learned about discipline and mental preparation, Al replied, but applied to psychological territory instead of physical territory. The training is just as intense, but the battles are fought inside your head. Word of the confrontation spread through New York's boxing community within hours, not as gossip about a celebrity encounter, but as a lesson in respecting different forms of strength and mental preparation. Tyson never again made dismissive comments about actors, and privately told training partners that his conversation with Al Pacino had taught him that there were forms of toughness he'd never considered. The story became legend among both fighters and actors, cited as proof that authentic strength could exist in psychological territories that were invisible to traditional measures of toughness, and that real warriors, whether in rings or on screens, deserved recognition from anyone serious about understanding what it meant to face and overcome fear. Al continued his boxing research, but the dynamic at Gleason's had shifted completely. The serious fighters who'd initially viewed him as a Hollywood intruder now watched his preparation with genuine respect, understanding that his exploration of violent characters required the same kind of mental conditioning they brought to physical preparation for fights. Years later, when boxing historians wrote about the psychology of championship fighters, Al's conversation with Tyson would be referenced as a moment when the sport's most ferocious champion learned that violence existed in dimensions beyond physical combat, and that some battles required more courage than even heavyweight title fights demanded. Tyson and Al developed an unlikely mutual respect, each recognizing that the other's approach to their craft required total commitment to exploring territories that most people would find too dangerous to enter, whether those territories existed in boxing rings or in the darkest corners of human psychology.